History is filled with ghosts. Empires that once ruled the world now exist only as broken stone, half-remembered names, and museum displays behind glass. Assyria, Babylon, Rome, the Maya. They rose, they dominated, and then they vanished. But one civilization did something no one else managed to do. It didn't just survive collapse, it absorbed it. For more than 4,000 years, China has been conquered, burned, divided, humiliated, invaded, starved, and nearly erased again and again. And yet, China is still here. Not as a memory, not as a revival, but as a continuous civilization. This is not a story about strength. It is a story about endurance, about suffering, about systems that mattered more than heroes, and about a civilization that learned something the rest of the world never fully understood. To survive forever, you must accept that nothing lasts forever. Long before there was an empire, before there were emperors, before the word China even existed, there were people living along two rivers, the Yellow River and the Yangtze. They were unpredictable, violent, destructive. They flooded without warning, wiping out villages overnight. Families starved, crops vanished, children disappeared beneath muddy water. For early Chinese communities, nature was not a backdrop. It was an enemy that could never be defeated, only managed. And that reality shaped everything. Where other civilizations imagined gods who rewarded bravery or conquest, early Chinese thought differently. They believed survival came from order, not glory, from coordination, not individual greatness. A single hero could not stop a flood, but a system could. From the beginning, China was not built around kings. It was built around organization. Villages coordinated irrigation. Communities stored grain together. Families learned that obedience was not weakness. It was protection. And slowly, something rare emerged. A civilization that valued stability more than expansion, continuity more than conquest, memory more than myth. As centuries passed, rulers rose and fell. Dynasties came into existence not because they were chosen, but because they could restore order. And when they failed, they lost the right to rule. This idea became one of the most dangerous political concepts ever created, the mandate of heaven. In most ancient civilizations, rebellion was treason against the gods. In China, rebellion could be justified. If floods worsened, if famine spread, if corruption grew unbearable, then heaven had withdrawn its mandate. This belief did something revolutionary. It made collapse acceptable. A dynasty could fall without destroying the civilization itself. Failure did not mean the end. It meant renewal. Where Rome clung desperately to broken institutions, China allowed its governments to die so the civilization could live. This cycle repeated for thousands of years. Unification, stability, growth, corruption, collapse, and then rebirth again and again and again. But cycles alone don't explain survival, because China didn't just survive internal collapse. It survived conquest. Again and again, foreign armies poured across its borders. Nomads, horsemen, warriors who conquered through speed and violence. The Mongols crushed cities that resisted them. The Manchus toppled dynasties. In most places, conquest meant cultural erasure. In China, something stranger happened. The conquerors became Chinese. They adopted the language. They used the bureaucracy. They ruled through Chinese systems. Because ruling China without becoming part of its civilization was impossible. Why? Because real power in China was never held by the emperor. It was held by the system. While Europe built aristocracies, China built examinations. A peasant boy born to nothing could study for years, memorizing texts, philosophy, law, and if he succeeded, he could enter the state. Not through blood, not through loyalty, but through competence. This bureaucracy outlived dynasties, outlived emperors, outlived invaders. When governments collapsed, the administrators remained. Records remained. Methods remained. Rome lost its bureaucracy, and chaos followed. China lost its rulers and kept functioning. Confucianism reinforced this survival instinct. It didn't celebrate rebellion lightly. It didn't glorify personal ambition. It taught people their place in a larger whole. Father to son, ruler to subject, elder to youth. To modernize, this looks like oppression. But for a civilization constantly threatened by chaos, it was insulation. When disaster struck, people knew how to behave, what was expected, what order looked like. And order, even in perfect order, was preferable to annihilation. But survival came at a cost. Innovation was controlled. Creativity was restrained. While Europe fractured and competed, forcing constant technological leaps, China chose stability. When gunpowder appeared, it was regulated. When ocean-going ships were built, they were dismantled. When trade threatened social balance, it was limited. China did not fail to innovate. It chose not to destabilize itself. And for centuries, that choice worked, until the world changed faster than China was willing to adapt. The modern age did not arrive gently. It arrived with cannons. European empires, powered by industrialization, tore open China's isolation. Wars were lost. Ports were seized. Sovereignty eroded. For the first time in millennia, China could not control the pace of change. The Qing dynasty collapsed. Civil war followed. Famine returned. Foreign occupation humiliated the nation. Millions died. This was not just political collapse. It was civilizational trauma. And yet, China did not disappear, because the idea of China was older than any dynasty, older than any ideology, older than defeat itself. When communism arrived, it did not erase the past. It replaced the rulers, but kept the logic. Central authority, mass organization, long-term planning, sacrifice for stability. Different language, same instinct. China didn't reinvent itself, it reconfigured. That is why modern China still thinks in decades, not election cycles. Why it prioritizes continuity over popularity. Why it fears chaos more than oppression. Because it remembers what chaos costs. China survived 4,000 years, not because it was always strong, but because it accepted weakness. Not because it avoided collapse, but because it normalized it. Other empires treated failure as the end. China treated it as a phase. And that is the difference between a nation and a civilization. History doesn't reward the loudest. It rewards the ones who last. And China learned that lesson before anyone else. China learned early that survival is not about winning every moment. It is about enduring long enough to matter. And endurance in China's history was never accidental. It was engineered. After centuries of dynastic cycles, invasions, and internal collapse, China developed something almost no other civilization truly mastered: collective memory. Not memory as nostalgia, memory as warning. Every famine was recorded. Every rebellion studied. Every failed reform remembered. History in China was not entertainment. It was instruction. Officials were trained to read the past not for inspiration, but for prevention. What caused collapse before? What signs appeared first? Which mistakes were repeated? This obsession with precedent made China conservative, but resilient. Where others chased novelty, China asked a colder question: will this still work in 100 years? But resilience does not mean peace. The lives of ordinary Chinese people were often brutal. Peasants worked land that barely fed them. Taxes crushed entire villages. Corrupt officials abused power with little mercy. Rebellions were drowned in blood. Millions died across centuries. China survived, but not gently. This is important, because the survival of a civilization does not mean the happiness of its people. It means something harsher. It means the system outlived individuals, and individuals knew it. A farmer did not expect justice. He expected continuity. He planted knowing famine might come. He raised children knowing war might take them. But he also knew something else. After the suffering, life would continue. Someone would still speak his language, farm the same soil, remember the same stories. That belief kept people rebuilding instead of fleeing. Contrast this with Rome. When Roman authority collapsed, identity collapsed with it. Local loyalties replaced imperial ones. Language fragmented. Law disappeared. Rome became memory. China never allowed that fracture. Even when the state collapsed, culture remained unified. Written language stayed consistent. Classical texts were preserved. Values endured. A man in the Tang dynasty could read words written centuries earlier. A scholar under the Qing could study the same moral philosophy taught 1,000 years before. This continuity was not romantic, it was deliberate. Then came the 20th century, and everything China knew about survival was tested at once. Empires no longer rose and fell slowly. They were annihilated. Technology accelerated history itself. China faced foreign domination, internal collapse, ideological warfare, and mass starvation. Simultaneously, the old systems failed. The scholar officials could not stop machine guns. Confucian harmony could not negotiate with imperialism. China broke, warlords tore the country apart. Villages were burned, cities starved. The Japanese invasion inflicted wounds that still live in memory. Massacres, occupation, humiliation. This was not a dynastic collapse. This was existential, and yet again China adapted. Communism did not succeed in China because it promised equality. It succeeded because it promised order. After decades of chaos, people wanted predictability more than freedom. They wanted food to arrive, railways to function, authority to be clear. The Chinese Communist Party understood something outsiders often miss. Ideology was secondary. Control was primary. Centralization was familiar. Mass mobilization was familiar. Sacrifice for the collective was familiar. The language changed, the structure did not rise. But survival has a price. The Great Leap Forward killed tens of millions. The Cultural Revolution shattered families, erased trust, and destroyed generations of knowledge. And yet, even these disasters did not end the civilization. Why? Because once again, collapse was treated as error, not apocalypse. The system absorbed the trauma, adjusted, moved forward. When China finally opened to the world economically, it did so cautiously. Markets, but controlled. Growth, but supervised. Technology, but monitored. Other nations saw hypocrisy. What you say, China saw survival. Every reform was filtered through a single fear: chaos. Because China remembers what chaos does better than any other civilization on earth. This is why modern China prioritizes stability over morality, why dissent is feared more than stagnation, why control is valued more than spontaneity. It is not because China lacks imagination. It is because imagination once nearly destroyed it. Now, look at the world today. Empires do not announce their collapse. They decay quietly. Institutions lose legitimacy. Citizens lose trust. Systems stop adapting. Rome did not fall in a day. Neither will modern powers. China understands this. It plans not for victory, but for survival after failure. This is the most uncomfortable truth of its history. China expects collapse and prepares for it. So how did China survive 4,000 years while others disappeared? Not because it was stronger, not because it was kinder, but because it accepted a brutal reality. Civilizations do not live forever unless they are willing to change who holds power, without changing who they are. China never worshipped its governments. It worshipped continuity. That is why dynasties could fall, why ideologies could change, why leaders could be erased. Because the civilization was always bigger than the ruler. Empires that died believed they were permanent. China survived because it never believed that lie. History is not impressed by greatness. It is impressed by endurance. And China, more than any other civilization, learned how to endure. Endurance, however, does not make a civilization virtuous. It makes it cautious. China's long memory does not look backward with pride. It looks backward with fear. Fear of fragmentation, fear of hunger, fear of millions moving without control. This fear is invisible to outsiders, but it shapes every decision. Where other nations ask, what is right? China asks, what prevents collapse? That question has guided emperors, revolutionaries, and modern technocrats alike.
Western history often celebrates rupture.
Revolution as progress, disruption as innovation, breaking systems to build better ones. China learned the opposite lesson. Breaking systems kills people first and fixes problems later, if at all. So China repairs from within. Ferociously, sometimes brutally, but always with continuity in mind. This is why China never fully embraced religion as absolute truth. Buddhism was absorbed, Taoism blended, Confucianism institutionalized. No faith was allowed to outrank the state, because when belief replaces order, civil wars follow. China saw this early. The Taiping Rebellion, led by a man who believed he was the brother of Jesus, killed more people than most modern wars. To China, ideology untethered from control is not inspiring. It is lethal. Even modern nationalism in China is different. It is not emotional. It is civilizational, pride is not placed in conquest, but in survival. The narrative is simple. We are still here, after famines, after invasions, after humiliation. Still here? That persistence becomes identity, but endurance has limits. A system that prioritizes stability can slowly suffocate creativity. Control can become rigidity. Harmony can become silence. Continuity can become stagnation. China has walked this edge many times. Sometimes it leaned too far, and history punished it. The real question is not whether China survived the past. It is whether the strategy that preserved it for 4,000 years can survive a world that moves faster than memory. Digital speed breaks historical rhythm. Global markets ignore borders. Ideas move faster than control. For the first time, China faces a threat it has never fully encountered, a future that cannot be delayed. And yet, even now, the old instincts remain. Centralize. Observe. Adapt cautiously. Preserve unity at all costs, because China does not fear losing power. It fears losing coherence. Empires like Rome collapsed when citizens stopped believing the system served them. China learned to reverse the logic. The system does not exist to serve happiness. It exists to prevent disaster. That bargain has kept it alive. Whether it can keep it legitimate, that remains uncertain. So, when people ask why China survived while others vanished, they often expect a technological answer, or a cultural myth, or a single brilliant invention. But the truth is far more uncomfortable. China survived because it accepted suffering as the price of continuity. It chose endurance over glory, order over freedom, memory over reinvention, again and again. History does not reward beauty. It rewards systems that learn. Rome built monuments. China built habits. One inspired the world, the other outlived it. The final lesson of China's history is not a promise. It is a warning. Civilizations do not disappear when they are defeated. They disappear when they forget why they survived in the first place. China remembers. That is why it is still here, and why the world must understand it, not as a nation, but as a civilization that learned how to wait. Waiting in China's history is not passive, it is strategic. Dynasties fell, but the land remained. Rulers were replaced, but the language endured. Ideologies shifted, but hierarchies survived in new forms. This ability to separate the state from the civilization is China's greatest invention. Rome failed here. When Rome collapsed, law collapsed. When law collapsed, identity fractured. When identity fractured, the civilization dissolved into regions, tribes, and memories. China never allowed that chain reaction. Even when emperors were overthrown, the idea of China remained intact. A farmer did not ask who ruled. He asked whether order would return. And it always did. This is why Chinese history feels cyclical instead of linear. Not because nothing changed, but because survival demanded repetition. Collapse. Rebuild. Centralize. Stabilize. Over and over. Each cycle left scars. Each scar taught restraint. This also explains why China never romanticized the individual. Heroes mattered, but systems mattered more. A great emperor could expand borders, but a weak bureaucracy could starve millions. So the bureaucracy endured. Impersonal. Slow, relentless, It was never designed to inspire, it was designed to function after the ruler was gone. Western empires chased immortality through legacy. Statues, names, monuments. China chased immortality through continuity. No single leader mattered more than the flow of administration. No dynasty mattered more than the idea of order. That is why conquerors failed to erase it. The Mongols ruled China, but became Chinese. The Manchus conquered China, but governed as Chinese emperors. China did not resist invaders with identity. It absorbed them with structure. This absorption is not kindness. It is gravity. Strong enough cultures pull others into their orbit. China's gravity came from scale, memory, and routine. It made resistance exhausting. Assimilation became easier than destruction. But this same gravity now pulls inward. Modern China carries the weight of its own history. Every reform is haunted by past disasters. Every loosening of control triggers fear of collapse. Every demand for freedom is measured against famine, rebellion, and war. This is why China's future will never look like anyone else's. It is not moving backward. It is moving carefully. The world often asks whether China will change. It already has, many times. The real question is whether the world understands how China changes, not through rupture, not through revolution for its own sake, but through controlled evolution, sometimes slow enough to look frozen. China did not survive 4,000 years by being right. It survived by being adaptable without being fragile, by letting governments fall so civilization could live, by sacrificing generations so the line would not break. That is not a moral victory. It is a historical one. Empires that disappeared believed collapse was unthinkable. China built collapse into its thinking, planned for it, normalized it. History will judge whether this strategy can survive the century ahead. But history has already answered one question clearly. China did not survive because it was destined to. It survived because it learned early that permanence is a lie. Only continuity matters. And continuity is earned, not inherited. That is why China is still here, not triumphant, not innocent, but unbroken.